Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Others will be trickling in soon. I wanted to welcome you to today's Transform Finance Investor Network webinar on the topic of building a community-centered fund using a grassroots approach to fund investing and using the live case of the IDEX Buen Vivir fund. I'll give you a brief introduction now, and then we will be joined by Joanna Levitt from IDEX, who will give us more concrete information on how this fund is being conceptualized and how it's looking now, and by Betsy Deatle of Deatle Partners, who is a committed investor into this fund and a member of the Transform Finance Investor Network, who will give us a little bit the perspective of the LP, of the investor into the fund. As a first thing, unless there is any update from the members of the network, I just wanted to welcome the Gary Community Investments. Is the newest member that we have added, working out of Colorado, matching grant making and investments throughout the state of Colorado to advance the well-being of the state's children. So thank you. And Luis Duarte, that many of you know, is our main point of contact there. So turning to today's presentation with Joanna and Betsy, I would like to start by framing it, as always, within the context of the community-centered approach that Transform Finance advocates for, along these three lines of deep community engagement, the creation of the value that remains local, and in a slight tweak on our usual language, considering that fair allocation of risk and rewards also as a matter of being thoughtful around the power dynamics that exist whenever you are creating a fund and doing investments. And we'll see that the IDEX Buen Vivir fund comes close to hitting all of these three aspects. And I will mute you all. Please mute yourselves if you're there as well, so we minimize the background noise. Great. So going back to the community-centered approach, so deep community engagement is the one that I would like to look at first, because it's something that has a reason, as we saw in the webinar last month with People's Community Market, where oftentimes it is really seen as another, if somewhat different, way of extracting value, this times in the form of knowledge from affected communities, as opposed to the meaningful type of engagement where the relevant community is actually playing a direct role. And so we thought of this as a matter of putting into practice this idea of participatory work. So there's been some development in the last few years on this idea of participatory grant making. And last year, we were asked to speak at the International Human Rights Funders Group on what would that approach look like in the case of participatory investing, right? What would it take to truly be in a partnership with the communities and all the other stakeholders in the case of investments as well as grants, and really taking the best practices that have arisen, especially in the Lafayette report around participatory grant making, and trying to apply those to investments. I must say we have not seen many examples of that in practice. RSF Social Finance uses an approach of that sort, at least in the interest rate setting for its borrowers. And IDEX, especially in the conceptualization of this fund, definitely comes close to it. And I'll leave it to Joanna to tell us more of that. So there is a spectrum, as this slide puts forth, of community engagement. The way that we often see it is largely limited to the informing communities of what is happening. If we think of some of the more traditional examples, say when there are big infrastructure projects, dams, mining operations and the like, it goes from the informing, sometimes maybe to a weak form of consent, versus moving all the way along that spectrum, actually involving the community in the process itself, taking into account their aspirations as well as their needs, to collaborating with the community members, making sure that they are really part of that decision-making process, and ultimately empowering the community members so that they have the decision-making authority over projects as well, and it's not merely a consultation type of idea. And another point that we would like to hit on in trying to see how this fits within a broader conversation that we've been having around impact investing, its potential, and its current shortcomings, is this notion of capital being at the service of something, right? Capital no longer driving the bus and everybody having to fall in line with the needs of the asset owners, but really capital being conceived as being something that is offered to a community that needs it. So what do you need as a community, or what do you aspire to, and what are the terms on which this would be acceptable or welcome for you? Let me do another round of muting. There we go. That should do it. So yeah, really viewing the capital in terms of a power dynamic as something that is going to be serving these communities and is not going to be dictating its terms and trying to find projects and opportunities that meet the needs of that capital. More on that from Joanna and from Betsy. And another perhaps less often considered item that used to arise a lot during our work, and my work in particular with indigenous communities in the Amazon, is this notion of respecting the timelines of the beneficiaries. So we're used to a pretty quick turnaround on a lot of this. On a lot of these projects, we're used to funds where the deployment of time of money is across time is one of the factors that contributes to the financial returns of a project, and really stepping back for a second and saying, well, how can we try to match the timelines of those whom we consider to be the beneficiaries of these projects? If we're serious about this, trying to have a positive social impact on those communities, even their decision-making processes and timelines around those should be taken deeply into consideration. And the last piece, perhaps, around the way that we're considering the impact of a fund like this is starting to move beyond the single enterprise impact. So at that intersection of social enterprise and impact investing, you see a flow of capital into a single enterprise that has its own impact thesis that doesn't quite regard necessarily how the flow of capital overall affects a particular community, how the very notion of having outside capital coming in, oftentimes for the first time, is going to impact a particular community, and therefore the kind of relationships, the kind of power-based agency and accountability that will arise from that. So those are all things to start looking out for. One more exercise. If I find it, there we go. And as a last thing, in part because the groups with whom IDEX will be partnering on this project have historically been grant recipients from IDEX. One thing that we're interested in looking at is how the dynamic can change when you move from grants to loans. There are ways in which, again, traditionally in the PRI space, we have seen that dynamic changing for the worse, in part because of the actors that are involved in loan, as opposed to the more perhaps collaborative historical relationship that there is with a program officer. But there is a way in which this can be a welcome change in terms of how the injection of capital, besides providing the money itself, also provides an opportunity for agency within a community, for capacity building, for growing the ability of the community itself to deal with these flows of capital, plus the usual aspect of revolvability, which I don't necessarily think is a word, but the idea that this capital will be able to be recycled within these communities. The non-extractiveness piece is the second principle, as always, being thoughtful about where the value is flowing and looking at it from this ecosystem level, not just of non-extractiveness within a particular enterprise, but from a community in general. And I just wanted to remind you, we talked about that during the last webinar in terms of value leakage where we analyzed how the lack of a community-owned supermarket in West Oakland was causing $18 million per year to flow out of the community that could really be captured and regenerated within that same geographic area that, as we all know, could actually benefit from that capital. So with all that as a bit of stage setting, I will turn it over to Joanna Levitsia at IDEX Buen Vivir, I think, as Director of Special Funds, correct, Joanna?
Yes, that's it.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone for joining today. What I'm going to share about is the approach that we're taking at IDEX with the Buen Vivir Fund and why, how that approach came to be, and to talk about the investment opportunity that is emerging from this approach. So we're looking at grassroots-led investment for well-being. Before I start speaking about the Buen Vivir Fund as an initiative, I want to share a little bit about the IDEX approach overall, because this fund is very much rooted in the model of grant making and partnership that IDEX has developed over the last 30 years. And just one quick note, IDEX will be changing its name in about 3 weeks. We'll be unveiling a new brand and name. So we've been starting to call ourselves the organization formerly known as IDEX. So don't be confused if you start to hear about a new organization that is in fact not new. So I think the best way to understand IDEX is to think of us as sort of a hybrid of a foundation and a think tank. The members of the think tank include our grantee partners around the world. IDEX works currently mainly in 7 countries, in Peru, Mexico, Guatemala, India, Nepal, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. I say a think tank because the groups that IDEX partners with as grantees are all doing incredible innovation around new models for developing wealth, well-being, community-led development in their region. So if you're an IDEX partner and you have some sort of cooperative savings and loan fund or an agricultural system, you can bet that it's not the normal. It's a tweak or variation on the normal that's really incredible, and that's responding to local expertise and local knowledge about what will be most game-changing in that particular national or regional context. So IDEX really forms working partnerships with our grantees focused on lifting up new models of people-led development and also reforming models of grant-making, philanthropy, and aid so that funding partners are working in more effective solidarity with leaders on the ground. In terms of what the grant-making model itself looks like, IDEX often words it as trust-based, flexible, long-term funding. Trust-based because all of it is general operating. Once IDEX completes a vetting process and mutual evaluation with partner, it is completely up to them what is the best use of the funds. And the timeline of the fund, Andrea mentioned looking at how beneficiary timelines don't always match up with funder timelines. IDEX has a long practice of setting the timeline for each grant around what makes sense for that particular organization and context. And also the milestones for that grant are co-designed with the grantee. So that is just a little bit about the grant-making model that this is emerging from. So the story of where did Buen Vivir Fund come from? IDEX has done some investing in addition to grant making over recent years, but this fund is really the first time we're pulling that together in an integrated strategy and new program. About a year ago, IDEX was getting a very strong call to action to step into the investment space, really from 2 directions. On the one hand, a large number of the foundation peers that we work with throughout the US and Europe. IDEX often does re-granting and advising for major foundations in the US and Europe. Many of those groups were saying to IDEX leadership that it's been very welcome the way IDEX is shaking up business as usual in terms of grant making and putting forth new models of funding and partnership, and it would be fantastic to do the same in terms of impact investing and really looking at, in particular, the space that foundations can play who are in both grant making and impact investing. And interestingly, at the same time, as of last year, the majority of IDEX partners around the world do not just have charitably funded initiatives. The majority of them now have revenue generating initiatives, effective funds. Our partners were much farther ahead of us than IDEX in terms of really exploring with new models for social change led by investment. So our partners were also encouraging IDEX to think about what would it look like for IDEX to step more into that space in a partnership role with them. So to answer this question of what should it look like for IDEX to develop our own unique response to impact investing, co-created with our partners, I led a research process over late fall, early this year, talking to IDEX partners, staff, board, and also over 40 people working in the space of impact investing and alternative economy, domestically and internationally. And I want to flag 3 points that came out really strongly from that research journey in terms of what this fund needs to respond to. So the first is nothing new. We've all heard it before, but the pretty extreme lack of beneficiary voices when we're talking about agenda setting for impact investment and often even the design of a particular project. And I didn't mean to pick on SOCAP here by having that photo, but even in the more progressive conferences and spaces around impact investing, it's pretty striking how many people are talking about populations who are not present. So that we heard very strongly from IDEX partners is something that this needs to respond to from the level of setting the agenda and the vision. Second, a key point we heard a lot about was sort of inappropriate pressure on organizations to move toward revenue generation, even if that is not the best fit for the work, right? So sometimes work is best served by investment capital. That's what can really launch the work and its impact in the world. Other times, organizations have a very effective change model already going that is best served by grant making and is actually a disservice to put pressure on groups to, on top of that, figure out how to fit in a revenue generating model. So our response needed to really do thoughtful due diligence work to make sure that groups coming in for investment are indeed, the work they're doing is best served by that funding modality. And the last point is, well, I think it's best described actually by a fantastic blog post that's on the Transform Finance website by Aner Ben-Ami of Pi Investments called Square Peg Round Hole. But in a nutshell, it's the fact that over the past decade, we've had such a proliferation of diversity in terms of entities that are seeking and receiving impact investment, all kinds of new models for social enterprise, community funds, you name it. And yet the shape and structure of the investment itself continues largely to be sort of cut and paste from the terms used in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. So something I heard a lot in those conversations was we would really love to see new models of investment. And many times people would say, we'd love to see a new model like the working world. Our friends at the working world got a lot of great shout outs in those interviews. And also IDEX partners are very interested in that model. For those of you who don't know about it, I would encourage checking it out. It's a profit sharing model for investing in worker-owned co-ops. But all that to say, that's fantastic. They're getting a shout out, but that shouldn't have been the only group that I heard about in 40 interviews in terms of really alternative investing models. So there's a need for more of us to get really creative around questioning even fundamental assumptions around what term sheets should look like and what can still make money. So as we responded to those 3 points, this framework of Buen Vivir came out very strongly in conversations with IDEX partners around how we wanted to frame this. I'm going to take a second to talk about this before I go into the nuts and bolts of the investment structure, because I think it's really important. The first conversation that I
Joanna,
had,
sorry, a quick
yeah,
follow-up on the last point around the deal structures, the investment terms and models, and that square peg
yeah,
round hole. Bruce Campbell, who is a member of the investor network as well, has been working on a term sheet project. I don't remember if it
mm-hmm,
has a more official name, trying to document what different aspects have appeared within this impact investing ecosystem and turning it into embed, I think it is for now, into a tool that can be used by investors to really see how you could put together a term sheet using different elements that are perhaps a little bit more unconventional that are being used across the industry. So
mm-hmm.
check out Bruce Campbell's model, everyone.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, and folks, please do feel free to insert questions as we go. That's fine, and comments to keep it dynamic. Um, so the first conversation where the Buen Vivir framework came up was when I was speaking with a longtime IDEX partner, a group, the acronym is AFEDES. It's led by young Mayan indigenous women in Guatemala. And the director said, Joanna, I want you to understand that with our banking and cooperative loan model, anytime before we start an activity that will bring money into our community, we must first start working on our minds. We need to think about what have we been taught in terms of how economy and money should fit into our lives, and maybe think about what we may want to unlearn and how we can imagine a version of economy and money making fitting into our lives and community that best supports our values and the work we want to create. So this is really, it's touching on the point that Andrea spoke to about what is capital in service to. And I have been quite struck by the depth to which a number of IDEX partners are thinking about this and really developing strong models and checks and balances and evaluation systems that underpin capital being in service to the change that they're making rather than the tail wagging the dog. And Milvian Aspuac, the woman I was speaking to, said for them, the framework they follow is Buen Vivir. She used her Mayan language version of that term. But Buen Vivir is the Spanish translation for a concept that appears in many, many, many indigenous groups throughout the Americas. Traditionally, it was the framework with which they talk about how to achieve and maintain balance, harmony, and well being between individuals, families, community, and ecosystem. In the past 5 to 10 years, this has really emerged. It's been invoked more and more by social movements that are challenging a mainstream neoliberal economic agenda to say, you know, counting GDP is not enough. We actually have some sophisticated existing systems for understanding what well being is and how economy should fit in. So, IDEX partners were very excited, not just in the Americas, but also other regions, about having Buen Vivir be our guiding framework for this work so that we really are starting with working on our minds, all of us, founding investor circles, staff, and IDEX partners, to question what has been sort of handed down or cut and paste in terms of investment terms and models, and start with really deep thinking about what this should look like to be in service to the change we want to make. For those who are interested, I'm happy to share more resources about Buen Vivir, but it's a really fascinating sort of systems thinking approach to change and economic activity, incorporates environment as well as human well-being, and also very much assumes that or requires individuals to you must cultivate your own well-being to be able to do work that grows well-being in the world. And one last point about this that helped me understand that point when I was speaking with an IDEX partner in South Africa. She's actually herself a refugee woman from Congo, and I was speaking with this with her about this framework, and she said, "Oh, Buen Vivir, I haven't heard that before, but we say Bien Vivre in the Congo. That's familiar to me, and yes, that makes sense. Let me tell you about what that would mean for my community. What I see here is that we have many, many refugee women in South Africa who have fantastic and very viable startup business ideas. And they're ideas that would allow them to stay closer to their home, to be with their families, and to be more economically solvent than they currently are. But the options for investment are so scary in terms of the predatory lending practices, in terms of what kind of options are open to you as a refugee and in some cases undocumented, that folks walk away from that opportunity and instead do the long bus ride to work at the factory 2 towns away. And she said, it would be incredible to be able to be a part of a process to design what investment could look like that would allow us to say yes to investment without fear. So I think there's a lot of pieces that partners are bringing to thinking about investment in a framework of Buen Vivir. The initiative as a whole, Buen Vivir Fund, has two equally important goals. Yes, first one is to deploy investment resources aligned with grassroots group work, so to get new and appropriate resources to groups who are doing the most incredible new economy work. And second, and equally important, is to influence broader investment practices. So we're going to be very intentional about capturing learnings, new models, findings, and sharing those. A bit about how we're structuring the fund. Let me first say that perhaps the most distinguishing feature about this fund and our approach is that we have decided that over the next 6 months, the details of the terms, the practices, and the governance structure are going to be determined via a co-design process with our founding circle of investors. We have 8 investment slots for this founding circle, 5 of which are already filled. And we also are bringing in 12, maybe 15 IDEX partners who have the strongest track record in their economic work and who are engaged in really deep thinking about new economic models. So for year 1, where everyone participating is committing significant time and thought leadership to being a part of shaping what the fund will look like. So some of the questions that may come up today, I may say we're working on that. We haven't landed on a decision yet, but what we are clear about is this overall structure here. So it is IDEX's role to convene and bring together investors who are committed to the values of this fund, and for year 1, who are committed to being a full part of this co-design process. That's including individual investors, families, some investment offices, and several foundations. IDEX will pool together those resources and then distribute them across what we're calling member funds. Though it's both funds and direct investment initiatives. I'll say a bit about that in a second. IDEX partners then further distribute those funds, and over time will replenish the overall Buen Vivir fund. I mentioned before that a number of the folks we spoke with were very interested in the working world model. We are looking at developing our own version of essentially a revenue sharing or profit sharing agreement. So let me say a little bit more about what like a sample investment would look like. And let's see, I'll do just first to say a bit more about where is this money going for a sample investment in terms of a fund. So a member fund that will receive the investment capital and deploy it to additional initiatives. The group I mentioned in Guatemala, AFEDES, they have a really fantastic savings and loan model, and their participation in IDEX Buen Vivir Fund will be the first outside infusion of capital, because they've been building up that model with local assets from the women involved in the fund, and they're ready for a first infusion of outside capital as long as that capital follows the values and practices and timelines that they've developed. And a number of their the groups to which they're lending to are ready for infrastructure upgrades for their enterprises, particularly around traditional medicinals and agricultural products. In terms of a direct investment example, another longtime IDEX partner, the Women's Awareness Center of Nepal, they are actually, in terms of financial volume, our biggest partner. That organization is now a network of 42 banking cooperatives all over Nepal, all led and managed by rural women, and they manage now over 2 million US in assets. So this group, Waken, actually said to us, we don't really need an infusion of capital into our cooperative model, but what we would really love is we have ready to go a business plan for our first enterprise, which would be creating a women-led agricultural distributor. So their middle women would be replacing the current middle people who are often exploiting their growers. And they have a really strong model for a business initiative, but they need a first investor because it's an untraditional investment in a number of ways. So that's an example in which the fund would make a direct investment into that initiative. And just a little bit to paint a picture of who are we investing in year one. IDEX has done a deep look at all of our partners around the world, and as I said, selected the ones with the strongest track record in their economic work and also deep commitment to developing new financial models. It turns out that the majority of those in the cohort are women-led organizations and enterprises, and the majority are working in sustainable agriculture or agroecological practices via work that builds local wealth, food sovereignty, and climate resilience. So just to talk about life cycle of a sample investment, getting a bit more concrete here. So let's say in the distribution enterprise that Women's Awareness Center in Nepal wants to create, the fund would put in, let's say, 50,000 US, and likely duration for payback would be 3 years. And let's say, like, of that 50,000, where it looks like we're headed right now via our co-design process, the investment would be made based on a profit sharing agreement customized with that cooperative. So that agreement will identify a specific success milestone in terms of revenue generation and the intended timeline, the realistic timeline in which the group expects to be able to reach that success milestone for level of revenue generation and profit generation. For example, 1 year after the investment is made, we expect to be able to start doing 50% profit sharing back to the fund. So upon reaching that, the cooperative will begin to make profit sharing payments back into the fund, likely on a quarterly basis. A profit sharing completion timeline will also be set with the cooperative based on the best of everyone's knowledge and predictions, and a timeline at which it'll make sense for that investment. So let's say 3 years, maybe up to 5 years. And at the point of profit sharing completion, that cooperative should have repaid at minimum principal plus 1 to 3% per year, or at maximum 3, maybe even 4 times the initial investment. We're looking at building in upside exceptions for the groups that are having particular success. And in terms of that investment, what are the returns that we expect? In terms of the community level, the investees, the member funds, will be taking the lead on the front end of deciding what are the Buen Vivir returns that they are working toward. In other words, what's the increased well-being they want at an organizational level in terms of organizational capacity, in the community and people who they're serving, etc. And we'll be working together to track that. And then returns to the fund, in addition to our modest and just financial return, we also are going to be very rigorous about knowledge returns, because as I mentioned, this is a learning opportunity and we want to create new models. So, our first upside exception that's able to do 4 times or 3 times, we want to really document that. And same if there's an initiative that is not able to do payback, we also want to really track the knowledge from that. Um, Let me pause here for a minute to see if there's any questions up until now.
And let me take a second, Joanna, to unmute folks,
Okay,
especially
sure.
the ones on the phone. So yeah, if you are using the webinar software, you can also type a question into the chat box. If you are on the phone, you can't do that. So I'm unmuting you and I will remute you shortly. Any questions, anyone? Okay, I think we can go on, Joanna. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, and feel free to chime in. Um, so to talk a little bit more about the investment opportunity, as I mentioned to you all, we're starting small, right? We're beginning with 8 slots for our founding circle of investors, and we're launching the fund at 1 million US. So for a investment fund, this obviously is a smaller size. We're doing that inspired by, I guess, as best summed up by Milvian and other partners, the importance of starting with working on our minds, right? So we're going quite deep in year one to get the structure, terms, and practices right. Um, so, what we're hoping we can do with this fantastic group of investors and partners is build the groundwork for this fund to really grow with integrity. And we do anticipate significant growth over the near future, including the next 5 years. We have a really robust pipeline, including through the knowledge and connections of IDEX partners. Um, and we are still committed to starting slow and having a really solid first round. So there's 8 slots for founding investors. Each slot commits 125,000 investment capital, which will start being deployed in late 2016. Plus, for this first year, an upfront fund catalyst payment of 12,500, and that is essentially a payment to support the co-design process and to enable everyone to fully be a part of it, including IDEX partners. At least,
That
let's
part, Joanna, the catalyst payment will not be repaid, correct? It's more like a
correct
grant.
a grant. Hmm. Thank you, Andrea. We do have the possibility for smaller level investors to jointly fill one slot. For example, one of our investors that we're really excited about is Regenerative Finance, a group of young investors linked to resource generation. So several of them have pooled resources and have 2 point people who are serving as the representatives for that slot. It's also important to note that for year one, we are asking investors not only for this financial commitment, but we have a very specific set of time commitments that we're asking people to put in. Being present at 2 different meetings this year, helping to review drafts. We're looking for a group that's really fully on board with being part of the co-design and the learnings.
If I may jump in again for 1 second, Joanna, I think that idea of having several smaller level investors jumping in to fill one slot is pretty
Mhm.
powerful for the knowledge returns as well, right? You could have a group of people that, yeah, don't get up to the 125,000 level, but could jointly almost turn it into this learning exercise in being part of a fund at a much smaller level than they would normally even come close to being part of a fund.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we have a couple of folks across our current founding investors who are, this is one of we have some very seasoned investors and we have some, including family office, that this is newer and they're excited about the learning and capacity building opportunity for them. So this is an informal pledge up, a good faith pledge up front, and then we will have a more formal um, commitment in October after our terms are finalized. But I do just want to give hats off to our current investors who have come fully in board and pledged despite the fact that we still have no idea exactly what the terms will look like. So that's pretty incredible. I'll say a little bit on what's exciting about this in terms of how it brings together grant making and investment as a de-risking strategy. So on the one hand, folks looking in could say, wow, these are really different kinds of grassroots groups and different kinds of economic models than I'm used to investing in, and it could seem very new. And in some ways, it definitely is, and there are risks there. But what is really exciting with this opportunity is every single group who's joining as part of our founding cohort of investees of member funds, all of them have very strong existing relationship with IDEX staff. All of them have been partners for multiple years. In some cases, we have 3 groups who've been IDEX partners for almost a decade. And there is a very strong open channel of communication, of working knowledge about each other's work. IDEX has strong data and understanding about their track record and the nature of their work. And a really important piece that we cultivate at IDEX is this two-way relationship in which our grantee partners push back and they challenge IDEX, and they are welcome to say, actually, we think you're wrong on this. We think you missed a really key point. We think a better strategy is XYZ. So I think it's important to point out, diversity around the table isn't enough if people still feel silenced or are holding back. It's really important to have, as Andrea was pointing to at the beginning, power dynamics and that enable full communication and full contribution and influencing decision making from all kinds of groups around the table. So that is a really strong asset that IDEX brings to this space, because of we're able to capitalize on the investment in relationships that's been happening over the past many years. Just a couple more slides from me here, in talking about our current pipeline, and I mentioned a little bit our future pipeline. So current pipeline is composed of known IDEX partners, and we have a lot of IDEX partners who are excited to participate in this first round, but we opted for one reason or another to wait until we're further along with the fund. Mostly we went with groups it was most in line with their current work to spend the time and effort on new economic thinking modeled development. But for future pipeline, there are additional IDEX partners who want to participate. And then what we're really excited to do is tap the incredible knowledge and connections of IDEX partners. All of our grantees tend to be very plugged in to local, national, regional networks, movements, all kinds of associations, and they have a really strong strong knowledge about emerging investment opportunities in their region and a strong sense of what's actually happening on the ground, what are real risks, what are real opportunities. So we're looking forward not just to their informal guidance, but we're thinking about a model for the fund and an investment committee in which partners who've gone through a investment cycle are playing a real leadership role in governance of the fund and helping to identify future investments. Just a little bit more to break down what's happening with our co-design process between now and the end of the year. So we are already well into identifying shared aims, and in terms of who's shared aims from our investors, shared aims from our investees, and also starting now to identify key questions and challenges. There are a lot of them, and it is a challenge to be working in multiple different national contexts, right? So my role over the next few months is gathering all these proposed solutions and synthesizing them into, all right, here is our best guess at what the draft fund structure, terms, and practices need to look like. And these are practices that are going to apply throughout the chain of investment. So in terms of how investors interact with and give to IDEX to pool the fund, how IDEX then distributes to the member funds or direct investment opportunities, and how those entities then facilitate an investment in their local arena. We will be coming together in person in October with our investees and investors to really go deep and workshop the key questions around this and finalize our model for the fund. We're looking at having some sort of resource folks and allies, advisors there as well, including some staff from the working world and Transform Finance. And seem to be on track to be able to finalize that new structure and governance plan and set of terms after the meeting in October to start deployment of investment capital in November, December. In all of these conversations, we're thinking a lot about replicability and scalability. I mentioned to you all we're wanting to lay the groundwork now to grow with integrity. And there are some real challenges with trying to find the sweet spot of what is the right size for individual investments, for overall fund as we grow, and incorporating transaction costs for working in different national contexts, and thinking about how we can set us up to grow to have a much bigger absorption capacity for bigger amounts of capital in the near future. I think last from me for now, just to say a bit more about the challenges. One is it is an intensive time commitment for everyone for year one. So thinking about, what does that mean for IDEX staff, for our partners, to make sure the time and resources they're putting into thinking and researching this with us is supported, including with additional grant capital as needed. And for our investors, they are also, making time. So that's a challenge, but also an exciting opportunity. And then definitely a challenge moving forward is a number of the national contexts in which we're working are really moving targets in terms of legislation around how international investment capital can enter the country. So we're really going to need to lean on our partners and their local legal and technical advisors to make sure we have a strong system for each country, both for money in and for returns out back to the fund, right? So that will be a challenge. But we have an amazing group of people and minds and hearts around the table. This is a photo from a recent IDEX learning exchange in Mexico. If you join in, you can expect conversations around the table like this. And I'm really confident that we have the right people in the room to develop really thoughtful solutions to these challenges. So I'm going to stop there, but look forward to questions and comments when we get there. And should I hand off to Betsy? Back to you, Andrea.
Yeah, I was just going to make one closing comment on this
Please.
slide. I really admire, Joanna, how among the challenges what you chose is, the time that goes into it and this kind of macro environment shifting regulations. Whenever we have been in conversations around something that is innovative, whether it's tweaking or really transformative, most folks tend to be like, oh, the lawyers don't want to do this, or the accountants are uncomfortable for this. And I'm delighted to see that in your view of the world, that's stuff that we can take care of. Yeah, it's going to be a pain, but it's not a challenge. The real challenges, are getting to these deeper processes. Before we hand it over to Betsy, let's see again if anybody has questions and would like to chime in. Feel free to either put them in the chat or unmute yourselves.
And can I say one quick thing to what you just said, Andrea?
Please.
Just around the challenges, it's, though I do tend to be optimistic as a person sometimes, it's not just me individually, but really, if you look at the context in which our partners have made their economic initiatives work in spite of unbelievable structural discrimination or complete lack of access to formal investment and banking services, it's my optimism on that comes more from seeing what they're already creating and making work, and knowing we can lean on their resourcefulness and insight and contacts. But there are nonetheless real challenges. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joanna, for all the fantastic work that you've been doing and the leadership that you bring to it. And thank you also for joining us at 7 a.m. your time, since you're in Hawaii. So very much appreciated. So with that, let me turn it over to Betsy Deatle. Betsy, we are absolutely delighted that you could join us to share a little bit about your views on this and what you know about this one.
Andrea? question.
Andrea?
Go ahead.
Oh, yes. Hey, it's Bruce Campbell. Sorry, I'm outside, so if there's some background noise, I apologize in advance. And thanks for the pitch, by the way, about our project, which I'll actually be able to share a beta version of the website soon, which includes a catalog of some of the innovations we found around financing based on things like a revenue share model or innovative ways of doing investment transactions. I did have, I guess, one question, one observation. The question is, will there be anyone at the table representing the ultimate recipients of the investment?
That's a great question, Bruce. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to being in touch about the work you all are doing and compiling. Yes, they're in two ways. A number of our partners, well, first off, most of the IDEX partners, the staff of the organizations are from the communities themselves that they're serving. And, in other contexts, there are more of a bit of a divide between the staff and the community. So we're going to support, in many cases, folks from the sort of ultimate beneficiary end of those funding initiatives to be with us. And also I mentioned that we're providing additional grant support to IDEX partners for their work in this co-design process. So all of them, in advance of that meeting in October, are doing pretty extensive work in terms of community workshops, conversations, data gathering, so that they can arrive there and not just say, hey, this is my thought on this as an individual, but they can actually say, based on the conversations we've had over the past few months, I can tell you really strongly, this is the number one concern, or this is the number one priority for the folks we're serving. But thank you.
Okay. Yeah, very, very cool. And I appreciate very much the work that you're putting into developing this kind of collaborative model. On the observation side, I will say that I think the reasons why many lawyers or accounting professionals are uncomfortable working to develop these structures like this is that, often the challenge you have is that the legal system, that these new structures don't really fit into the existing legal models in the country. And just as an example, so people talk about revenue share agreements in the U.S., but the IRS doesn't understand that kind of model. So there's no tax bucket that they can put the returns from a revenue share agreement into. What their IRS ultimately does is decide, well, there's really only two kinds of investments. There's a debt investment and there's an equity investment. So I'm gonna actually classify this so-called revenue share agreement as one of those two things. And so I think it will be important to when you're doing this work to kind of understand that in some cases the design piece of this is going to be having to design things that work within a kind of a legal framework that doesn't kind of contemplate necessarily the kind of transactions that you want to engage in. And so, and there are workarounds and there are ways to ultimately accomplish what you're seeking to do, but it's not going to be without some pretty heavy lifting, kind of on the legal side in particular. So.
Good thing that we have awesome and value-aligned lawyers like Bruce that are get this sort of issue constantly. So, thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, I was going to say, Bruce, why don't you come to Mexico with us?
Yeah, no, I may very well. I actually would be interested to. So.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Betsy, take it away.
Okay. And if I'm getting little periodic warnings that I may not have good video or audio, so if this does not work, let me know. I'm at the beginning of a hollow in Virginia, and we don't often have good video and audio connections. Just a little background on Deedle Partners. We're a family-to-family philanthropic advising firm, and we basically represent individuals. Most of our clients are individual families or individuals who they may have foundations, but they also do a lot of their giving through donor advised funds. And we basically manage those funds and all of the grant making out of them, and some of limited basis, some of the investing. And I just want to preface my remarks by saying, once again, that I feel like we've made an incredible decision here to become part of this process. I think after Joanna's presentation and Andrea's opening remarks, that anybody listening to this webinar sees the depth and the thoroughness and the thoughtfulness that these folks have brought to this process even before it started. And I think that was certainly one of the reasons for why we wanted to step in and work in this arena with them. There are basically three areas that intrigue us about this work and have really driven us to make a decision to make a commitment to be part of the first round, the first process of the Buen Vivir Fund. And that is the transformative impact of the work, the potential that it could really be transforming not only for IDEX's partners, but also for the larger field of impact investing. And secondly, the fact that it is focused on women. We are a company that has spent a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at gender, and we are a women-led company. There are three of us that are the senior partners, and all of our staff at present are women. So we feel very connected to the issue of working with women-led organizations and women-focused organizations. And finally, the learning potential that this opportunity offers on a variety of different levels is huge. As Joanna's pointed out, it also comes with a big time commitment, but I think we're really feeling at this point in our process of working through thinking about impact investing that we really need to make that kind of time commitment in order to get what we want out of the process. Our company's mission is to advance justice in the world, and that compels us to think about power dynamics. And one of the issues at play here is, how is impact investing affecting people on the ground? And so we feel very strongly that this aligns very directly with our mission as a company. And we're interested in those power dynamics, not just as they relate between a funder and a grantee, or a lender and a recipient, but how funders work with each other, and how the power dynamics play out in terms of capital, both as in loans, but also as philanthropic grants, and as investments. So this is all very much aligned with where we're coming from as a company. In terms of the second major focus that has intrigued us because of the sort of transformative potential, relates to infusing impact investing with principles of social justice. And I think the question on the table is, how do we do that? What are the things that we need to be doing to make sure that those principles are carried out? And so we're intrigued at the idea of thinking about how the terms get established, how the fund is governed, how the timeframes are set, what types of capital, when, all of those issues. The how-to, I think, is something that hopefully after a year or two of this work, we'll have some very good answers, and probably a lot more refined than they currently are at this point. And then finally, we have continually put systemic change front and center of the work we do. We work a lot across portfolio areas. So, for instance, we work on women and climate change. We work on agriculture and trade policy. And this is a chance. Did I just lose you? Did I lose you?
You're good. I can hear
Yep.
you.
Okay. I got a click of some sort. I didn't know what it was. And we have typically been fairly risk tolerant as funders. We like to think of ourselves as the first olive out of the bottle. When you have a bottle of olives, that first one's hard to get out, but once the first one comes out, the rest of them flow easily. And it sounds like actually there are a couple of other first out of the bottle olives in this group, and I hope that this is the beginning of making that process easier for others to join in. And finally, I think that we have typically had fairly patient capital. So uh, this this opportunity is again fairly well aligned with how we think about our work and how we do our work. In terms of the second area that really caught us when we were thinking about doing this investment was that we know that change does not advance the status and rights of the change that doesn't advance the status and rights of women is not transformative. And so the fact that this is that the primary recipients of these loans will be women was very much a critical determining factor for us when we thought about stepping up to the plate. We value the community self-determination model that IDEX has, the fact that they value and listen very carefully to women's voices, that they seek out opportunities that are gender transformative. We are very much looking for grantees and investments that have that gender transformative potential. So this is right up our alley, and I think the fact that these are long-term relationships that IDEX has had was also another indicator into as we go into this. And finally, thinking about the learning opportunities. Whoops, did I just lose that? The learning opportunities that will come out of this, both directly with the work we do with other investors, but also with the communities, the field building potential. We know that this kind of work is heavy lifting, and for a lot of investors, it's not they're not willing to do this yet. But we think that by being there at the beginning and helping to work through the process, that it will make it easier for others. And we were really, I think we're intrigued with the idea of being part of this learning community with not just other investors and IDEX, but also with Transform Finance and other experts in the field. For us, that feels like an incredible opportunity. It's something that we've been looking for a while. We've been working towards this process, and it's really something that I think we're very excited to be a part of, and look forward to the next 2 years, however long we stay in for. But I'll leave it at that. I don't know exactly how much longer we have, and I'm sure there's some questions out there. So thank you for letting me be a part of this gathering.
Awesome. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you to the rest of the whole team for all that you've done in this regard, and in particular for trying to foster new models and new relationships very much across the board of your work. I have one question while others might gather their thoughts, and at the cost of throwing a monkey wrench into the conversation. Again, with your investor hat on, Betsy, you've brought up few, if any, of the concerns that a traditional investor would bring up around, risk. What are the returns on the financial side? And my understanding is that you say, well, that's a secondary question compared to all these other important issues of field building, learning opportunities, creating agency, etc. And if I'm understanding that correctly, then the really big issue becomes how are we going to move from these initiatives that are really led by folks that are so deeply committed to this work towards a broader replication, a broader acceptance of models that are deeply infused with these principles, but might be of interest to investors that have more of that risk return type of consideration on the financial side.
My sense is that of the investors, there's going to be a range amongst us in terms of how risk averse we are and how much we expect to get out of this financially in terms of a return. And I think that's going to be part of those working sessions in the very beginning, is to sort of figure out what is the tolerance and what is the need from the various investors at the table. So I would say yes, we're probably at one extreme of that continuum, less concerned about the financial return and more interested in the social impact. But I think that the little that I know of the people that are going to be part of the working group, the investing group, that we're going to probably have to work that, because there is going to be a diversity of opinion at the table.
Can I add a point on that,
Andreas?
Was there another question?
Oh, I was going to add a quick point on that, if all right.
Sure.
Oh, and I see too, we have Kate from Regenerative Finance who's happy to speak to that. Just a really interesting dynamic for me on this point is actually in my conversations right now, the investors that we're working with are more, I think pretty much all of our investors who are on board are very impact first minded and are open to learnings and risk. And it is our IDEX partners, it is the grassroots groups who have been most rigorous about saying, look, it's great if this talks a good game and has beautiful sounding language in the world, but it is really important that we show people we're not messing around and that this works and that these are viable models for new economy. So I think that's an interesting twist in terms of who's pushing for making sure these actually are. A number of our partners says at the end of the day, what is going to make our advocacy most powerful here is showing people that we are indeed generating a return, and we are doing so in a way that builds wealth and well-being in our communities. So I would just challenge folks to even, sort of, how do you say, dar vuelta, like flip who may be pushing for what amount of returns. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you both. And hi, Kate. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add in my experience organizing with regenerative finance is there are so many young investors, especially inheritors, who are so hungry for investments that authentically reflect social justice values, especially around racial justice and thinking about decolonization and indigenous rights movements. And so people are so hungry for any kind of social justice return that I think the appetite for risk is just really, really high right now in terms of where people are excited to move capital and experiment and create new models. So
another, just a footnote on all of this, I think, and I meant to mention it in my remarks, is the role of philanthropy in this. And I think that's another piece of this work that we need to take a look at in terms of how does that help the process along. And I don't know that I haven't talked with Joanna at length about this, but it seems to me that's another part of the work that we need to look at. The fact that there is the $12,500 commitment that everybody must make to basically underwrite the convenings, and what would could something like this exist without that kind of it's not a great deal of money, but it's that kind of money is very critical to making the process work.
Yep. Thank you for mentioning that, Betsy. And I realize that's one thing I didn't mention in my remarks, but a lot of the sort of big name impact investment groups that are doing work in the global south, including around agriculture, they tend to be pretty quiet about the fact that their lending is often subsidized not only by layered capital, but by philanthropic grants. And IDEX is very committed to not being quiet about that, to be very loud and proud about, okay, the success of our investment work is absolutely linked to and building on the fact that we have been investing philanthropic capital and real relationships for a very long time. And yes, these are very strong economic models that offer lessons and viable new practices for revenue generation. And when we are really talking about building new economy, we do need to put in all kinds of capitals. So thank you, Betsy, on that. I think we will, as a group, be thinking more about what are key messages and practices that folks at the intersection of, it's no longer the old school, like just grant making or investment. What does it really look like to take a sophisticated and thoughtful approach to blending in that way?
Fantastic. And I will add, as a clarification to my own question, as we've been thinking about in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, or however flawed a framework that might be, and the figures of what is a 4 trillion gap in capital available for those, the question was more how will we be able to move from this $1 million fund to 4 trillion? And I love the detailed concept of the trim tab, right? Where you have these initiatives that are really at the beginning of starting to steer the ship, but that end up having a tremendous overall effect on whether the ship gets steered or not. But on the implementation side, I do remain very curious, maybe even optimistic about how we will move, from 1 million to 4 trillion, and what will be those sequencing steps in between, because I think that, to Kate's point, we might be able to get to 10 million, 50 million, $100 million in capital that is well aligned and willing to work along this deeply social justice rooted framework. I am a bit more concerned about the next level of expansion there. And hopefully, this will be something that gets us started.
And I think with the trim tab, Andrea, it is that little tab on the big rudder, and it essentially isn't just about moving the ship forward or slightly to the left. It's moving it, turning, making a real shift. And I think that's a good point. Is it we can get a couple $100 million, but can we get to a point where it's really starting to attract $1 trillion or a couple of $1 billion? That's another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and we have to start from somewhere. So I admired IDEX's willingness, and as Joanna said explicitly, to say, look, this is highly experimental still. So let's make sure that even the risk to all the stakeholders there are in this, but the capital providers, the philanthropic providers, the communities themselves that are putting meaningful time and effort and opportunity cost into this project, that we start at a base that we can handle.
Right. And also keeping in mind that for us, scalability is not just the absorption capacity of our fund, because we have set as two equally important goals, our own fund deploying and then the advocacy and learning. For us, a key component of scalability is, are we supporting other funds who want to go in this direction to apply these learnings? So I think that yes, we will be doing some exciting growth ourselves for sure, and we'll be contributing to that 4 trillion by supporting other folks to add to their trim tab in this way.
Very cool. So here I've put the slide with Joanna's information. She's Joanna at IDEX.org. I imagine there will be a migration period for your emails. They will not all get lost after June 4th. And yeah, I encourage you all to reach out with comments or questions, even if they don't come up now. Feel free to reach out to Joanna. She's extremely willing to share of her own knowledge and time with this. So thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you, Betsy, for all you do and for coming and joining us in this presentation today.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing how this evolves.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.